Good morning. So yeah, my name is Greg Hankins. I'm going to be talking about large BGP communities. Joe Schneiders is listed as a co-presenter. He is here with us in spirit, although not in person. So large BGP communities are a new technology to signal routing information between networks. I'll tell you a little bit about the history, how we got here, some of the things that we're doing to evangelize the technology, and most importantly, how we're going to get this out to network operators quickly. Let's see. Okay, if we look at a brief history of BGP communities, how people are using them, this RFC 1997 was 20 years old, so it was written in 1996. It was designed initially to simplify internet routing policies. It gives us this community that we use today, which is encoded as a 16-bit ASN with a 16-bit value. There's broad support in implementations. It's widely deployed by network operators and used for day-to-day internet routing. About 10 years later, we had something called the Extended Communities attribute, which was also published as an RFC. This adds a value, a label, a longer range. It was more used for layer 3 VPN routing, fewer implementations available, and also a slower adoption rate. And the thing about the Extended Communities attribute is that it's really complicated. In fact, there's an RFC that has the value allocations for this community. So it really wasn't what operators wanted for internet routing. This is what operators use today. A simple 1997 style community, and I have a couple examples here. There's one from NTT, which is the actual community values that they provide to their customers. And then there's also the one-step consulting index to the communities. So there's a bunch of operators that are listed on this web page, and Charles has a summary of all their routing policies and the communities that they use. So it's very widely deployed. It's also used in training material, operations procedures, policy documentation, and then also, I didn't know this, but Joe said that they have contractual obligations from their customers to provide these kind of communities and ways to manipulate the routing system. So it's especially difficult if you have a 32-bit ASN because there's no way to actually do this. So along came a problem. We knew that we'd run out of 16-bit ASNs eventually. Work started a long time ago to develop a 32-bit ASN in a couple different RFCs. The RIR started allocating 32 bits ASNs almost 10 years ago by request initially, and now there's really no distinction between a 32-bit ASN and a 16-bit ASN. An ASN is an ASN, and it can be one of either. It's used widely for edge and transit ASNs, so you can't really say, oh, the 32-bit ASNs are just edge ASNs. They're not. They're also transit ASNs. The fundamental problem is that you can't fit a 32-bit value into a 16-bit field. So that means if you have a 32-bit ASN, you can't use your ASN in these 1997 communities at all. So you have to do things where you use private ASNs as your communities or some other kludge, some other strange mapping. But then there's namespace collision because it's not unique anymore, right? You're reusing something between multiple providers. So the solution is something called large BGP communities. This is an effort that started in the IETF recently. It's a collaboration between network operators and system vendors, so it's not a vendor thing or it's not an operator thing that people are pushing. It's definitely a collaboration. And this is, I just want to mention some related work for 32-bit ASNs because there have been some efforts in the past. There's the RFC 5668, which was basically extending the 4360 style communities for 32-bit ASNs. It's kind of a micro optimization. It doesn't solve the fundamental problem of signaling ASNs in a 1997 format. There was an effort called Flexible BGP Communities, which seems to have lost momentum. There hasn't been a lot of work on that recently. And there's also an effort called Wide BGP Communities. There is still a lot of momentum behind this one. It's a complementary solution and a more comprehensive solution. It adds a lot more things like peer grouping, scope, and things like that, but there's no consensus or no implementations available today. And I think the solution needs more time to develop. So basically, what the state that we're in today is we have no community solution for over 10 years that supports 32-bit ASNs. So support for large BGP communities has been overwhelming. When it was introduced on the IDR list, there was a lot of support from both network operators, a lot of you people here in the room, and also from implementers. There were hundreds of messages on the adoption thread on the IETF mailing list, so very wide support and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of operators saying, yes, we need this, and please give it to us now. Don't talk about it for the next several years and come out with something in the future. We need something now is the overwhelming message that we got from network operators. So the goal is very simple. Like RFC 1997 communities, but larger. That's all we're trying to do. Design goals, as I said, simply larger. We didn't want to add any complexity or extra functionality. We're just trying to extend the communities that people have been using for 20 years to support 32-bit ASNs. There's also another important thing that's added, which is an action, so that now we can signal information having the source, the destination, and the target of the action without losing that information. We want to do something that's easy to implement, easy to adopt, easy to remember. The canonical representation is very easy to remember, easy to talk on the phone, or to tell people that have international language difficulties. And most of all, this is something that Joe Provo pointed out too, is it provides parity and fairness to people that have a 32-bit ASN because they can now use the same signaling that other people can that have 16-bit ASNs. So we don't have any namespace collision now between ASNs because you can use a native 32-bit ASN, you can use a native 16-bit ASN. These are all supported now. A couple things are out of scope. These all came up on the IDR list in discussion. We didn't want to add some sort of mapping, like an RFC 1997 to large communities mapping. I think that's really out of scope because everyone's routing policy differs, and a mapping that works for me might not work so well for you. So we just kind of left that up to the individual operators. We didn't want to add a TLV or a header. That kind of gets us back in the situation as the other community efforts where you're adding more and more functionality, and then you get everyone wants to throw on something, and then we have another kitchen sink implementation. So we just purposely wanted to keep it simple. It's designed to do one thing, and that's all it's going to do. We also didn't feel the need to define any new well-known communities because you can still use RFC 1997 in 16-bit communities. So those well-known communities that are defined work just as well with large communities. So no need to extend that. Encoding and usage is very simple. It's a 96-bit quantity. The canonical representation is 32-bit ASN, 32-bit numbers. So the representation is me, my ASN, some sort of action that we're doing together, and then your ASN. We're also working on a 1998 style usage draft with some examples and some routing policies and how this could be used in different providers to some policy definitions. So it's real simple. It's just encoded on the wire as a 96-bit quantity, and that's it. Here are a couple examples, and some of these you can argue, well, you can do that today, and that's true, but the fundamental point here is that there's no namespace collision or use of reserved numbers in these communities, and all of them allow us to use a 32-bit ASN in the me or you values. So for example, you couldn't do this today with 1997 communities. If you look at the first example, do not advertise to PRAS in North America. This is an example from NTT. If you have a 32-bit ASN, as I mentioned, you can't actually do that because you can't fit that value in the field. So you have to have some kludge to map or use an internal private ASN to signal that. If we use an AMSIX example for do not announce something to a route server peer, you also can't do that today with 1997 communities, so that's possible. And then some of the examples you could actually do today, but they just become more clear if you add large communities because you have the you and the me and the action. We have several milestones. I don't want to go through all of these, but the key point here is that this was first published in September, early September, and we're on a very fast path to move this through the IETF and get this out into network operators, as I mentioned at the start. There are a couple key points. Adoption, as I said, September. And then we had the first path code allocation at the end of September. That has caused some issues. I'll get to that in the next slide. We have some beacon prefixes that we announced. Those highlighted the issues. And then also, just a couple days ago on October 17th, the IDR announced last call. So 2-week last call on this one. So we're well on a very fast track towards RFC publication. Timeline overview, there's really 3 parallel efforts that are independent, but we're doing all of them at the same time. So the IETF, that's kind of the first step that defines the standard, so we have to get that started. And then once we have the early allocation and enough consensus in the IETF, then implementers started to work on this. Depending on what type of implementer you are, it can take you a couple days, or it could take you a long time. System vendors, I'll include my company, will be a little more, it takes us longer to get stuff out. Open source implementations had stuff literally out within a few days or a couple weeks. And then there's also the evangelism perspective and the education perspective. So that's what we're doing today. We want to get people to understand and learn about the new community. We want people to think about how they can incorporate this technology in the network in terms of the training, preparation, testing, deployment. And we have a lot of conference presentations planned. So it started out with Job giving his presentation at NANOG a couple months ago or a couple weeks ago. So I'm giving this presentation today, Job's giving it at RIPE next week, and we have a conference schedule mapped out so that we hit all the major conferences and some of the smaller ones in order to make sure that we educate all the network operators about this new technology. So there's a lot of things going on in parallel to get this into your hands. In terms of status, we maintain a website called largebgpcommunities.net, so the latest information will always be there. So I'll keep pointing you towards that. From an implementation status, a number of vendors have committed or planned something on their roadmap, so we listed that here. And if you don't see your vendor on here, then and you want to use this technology, then you should be talking to them. Now, it's important from an ecosystem perspective to also have the tools and other system support. So it's not just the BGP implementation that need to be updated. Obviously, if you have something and you can't troubleshoot it or monitor it, then it doesn't really do you any good. So those two things go hand in hand. So all of the tools, the major tools, have been updated to support large BGP communities. So the TCP dumps, Wireshark, PM Act was just updated a couple days ago. So again, visit the status page for the latest on all the implementations. Beacon prefixes. So this slide, I originally was just going to talk about the beacon prefixes, but this slide could also be entitled, Along Came Another Problem. So initially, the story here is that Job announced his 2 homeland prefixes on the internet with a large BGP communities. So this was all great. He has a v4 prefix and a v6 prefix. Implementations saw them on some implementations without large BGP community support. It showed up as an unknown transitive attribute, so that's great. It was able to display that. And then on implementations with BGP community support, it actually showed the large community that was signaled, so that's great. So after Job had done this for a couple days, his girlfriend noticed that she couldn't reach certain websites that she could reach before. So, okay, that was interesting. So through some troubleshooting and on #IX and talking to network operators, it turns out that the prefixes that were unreachable were behind a certain brand of Huawei routers. So that was interesting. After some more investigation, and this is what just came out a couple days on the IDR list, is that Huawei was squatting on path attribute code 30 and also 129. 129 isn't so relevant to our presentation, but 30 is the one that had been allocated by the IANA. So they would actually just black hole any route that came in with this new community attribute. So that left us in a position, well, what do we do now? So there's 2 choices. One is, we can go tell Huawei that they've been bad and ask them to fix their implementation. Okay, well, considering that there are a lot of routers out there, by the time this is rolled out into a release and then deployed by network operators, we're looking at a year, maybe 18 months. So basically, you black hole people that want to use this community for the next year or 2. So we didn't think that was a good solution. The other solution is, okay, let's just choose a new attribute code and deprecate the old ones and change all our implementations and move forward. So the consensus on the IDR list was that this was the best idea for the community and the best option to get this technology out there. So the attribute code 30 will likely change to something else. And then we'll announce new beacon prefixes and make sure that no one's black holing those as well. So interesting story there. There was also an issue with a Cisco IPv6 route, but that turned out to be something minor. So it's really interesting to see what happens if you just announce stuff on the internet with reserved path attribute codes. Okay, so here, if you're an implementer, here are the takeaways for 2 different groups. If you're an implementer, obviously you need to add support for 30 or whatever path attribute codes it turns out to be. Some implementers are providing an optional CLI command to enable it. That's fine. You can do that. You'll have to extend your routing policies. The matches and sets, obviously regular expressions now have to change. You need to extend your show commands, and please also make sure to update the debug commands and the packet dump output. Again, if we have something that's signaled on the internet, but we can't see it or troubleshoot it, then it doesn't really help us, because then we're just going to be in a position where we're stuck trying to figure something out again. Update all your documentation, your training material, your technical staff. This is a full new feature that has to be introduced, so it needs to go all through all the platform and feature progress lifecycle things like that. And this is especially the most important slide for you network operators. If you would like to use this new technology, large BGP communities, then you need to ask your vendors for support. Especially if they weren't on the slide that I mentioned previously, make sure to go talk to them and tell them that you want to use this technology. Or if you think it's something you don't want to use, then also go tell them what you want. This is a consensus-based group here, so if you don't want to use it, that's fine, it's optional. As I mentioned, the whole ecosystem has to support large BGP communities. So this is all your tool software, your provisioning software, your routing policies. Please publish this information as well, as many people have done on their web pages. And then you have to train your technical staff too. You have to train them how to use it and how to educate your customers on how to use it as well. So there's a big effort that goes into this. And that's it. So this was just a joint presentation that we did. As I mentioned, we're doing a lot of evangelism around this technology. So visit largebgbcommunities.net for the latest information. We have a whole bunch of news that we're putting up there as it develops. Also the implementations that I mentioned. And also, lastly, if you would like to reuse this slide deck in any form for your internal use or an operator conference, get in touch with us and we'll be glad to give you the slides and let you reuse it. And that's it. Any questions?
Hi, Chris Wood from Twitter.
Hey, Chris.
Hi. So it looks like this is going to need to require a new path attribute value. I guess 31 looks open. At the same time, has Huawei indicated any willingness to deprecate their squatting on value 30?
I don't think anyone from Huawei. I'm a little bit behind on my IDR mail, so as far as I know, I don't know if anyone has said what they're going to do, but that would be what we would encourage them to do.
Okay.
Matt PTAC, Yahoo. Extending Chris's question a little more broadly, as a community, we've endowed some of these organizations, such as IANA, with responsibilities and ownership for protocol parameters, assigned numbers, and things like that. Are we going to put up with vendors essentially co-opting that function and saying, hey, I know you've appointed a standards body, but what the heck, we're going to do our own thing? In some ways, rather than deprecate attribute 30, I would say as a community, we need to push back on vendors that try this and say, this is not cool. We've decided from the internet governance model that we've assigned that function to this particular standards body, and thou shalt not co-opt the standards body like that. This is not okay from the community perspective.
I agree 100%, and this has kind of been some of the feeling on the IDR mailing list about this topic has been exactly what you said. But again, in terms of just trying to get this out there in a usable form, I think there's really 2 separate issues. Is one, what do we do now? And 2, from a policy and in the bigger picture perspective, what do we do when vendors do this?
I agree on the expediency part for this, but as a community, I'm calling out to the community to say, this is a name and shame moment for us to say, if we believe in internet governance from the community-supported model, we need to push back when people violate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree.
Joe Provo, Google.
Hey, Joe.
Just wanted, to follow on to Matt's point, vote with your wallet, people. Tell your sales reps this is beyond not good. Sorry, frog in my throat. The only thing I wanted to come up originally and say thanks, Greg, for presenting this, and just put a thank out onto the stream for the members of the IDR for working with the operator community. We keep hearing IETF wants operator input. This is a really good example of, while there may have been some heat, a lot of light got shed, good work was done, and we're making fast progress.
Yes, absolutely agree. Yeah.
Rüdiger Volk, Deutsche Telekom. Well, okay, first of all, I was wondering for a decade whether we would get something like this, and I had lost hope to see this before I retire. On the issue of the use of code points and so on, I would like to remind the community that in the past years we have seen people injecting undefined attributes and causing trouble a couple of times. And we certainly, as operators, cannot rely on anybody who is connected to play according to the rules. Because, well, okay, most of us at one point in time actually will do some error and actually don't play ourselves by the rules. The thing that was done something like 5 years ago to respond to this was that, well, okay, most of the vendors actually introduced attribute filters. And I would actually point out that when you have a BGP, an eBGP session with some peer, what's going on in the attributes is essentially in the first place a bilateral thing. And well, okay, if you do not know exactly what you are doing yourself and what the other party is doing, you actually have to accept that responsibility, and actually, in cases where there is a problem, do filtering. So kind of the expectation of job with its beacons to expect that the new attribute would propagate everywhere to some extent is naive under this point of view.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the challenge is, okay, now we have this allocation code and someone's squatting on it, so what do we do in that case? And also, Rüdiger, I wanted to thank you because your comments at RIPE were very inspirational to the people that started this work. So hopefully we will see it before you retire.
Excuse me. David Farmer,
Hey, Dan.
University of Minnesota. I want to remind everybody who's saying it's bad that they're squatting, and yes, it is, but it's our job. There is no internet police, remember, that's something we like to talk about here. We have to make it not be okay. And this room writes the checks. So remember that when you're writing your check.
Yeah, and just to kind of expand on the unknown attributes, now there's discussion on the IDR list about, okay, well, what other unknown attributes are out there? So there's a couple ASNs that are actually announcing deprecated or even reserved path attribute codes. So to be determined what happens with that, because as Dan said, there is no internet police.
Jeff Houston, if you're soliciting opinions, expediency says move your code, because your deployed mass just isn't out there yet, and it's faster to do that. We're already circling around a whole bunch of legacy problems. This is another, and it's sad to see, and I wish they weren't there, etc., etc. And I totally agree, naming and shaming is wonderful, but the packets still have to move. And you've been crying out for this extended community attribute since about 1997. You finally got it. Change the code and put it out there would be my view.
Yep. Okay, I think that's the last question. So, as I said, get in touch with us and appreciate your time.